So for those of you who are on, let me ask you a question and let me have you put your answer in the chat box. And the topic of this webinar is on vertical development. So I am curious if you have heard of this concept prior to my communication with you about the concept. So give me a yes, you've heard about it before, or a no, you haven't heard about it before. And I see Jason. Jason, thanks for tuning in. Jason's right down the street from me, but haven't been able to see him in a while because of COVID. Great. I see Phil on, so that's great. So most of us I'm seeing are saying no. It looks like Vicky and Laura are some that have. Joseph's kind of maybe. Leo, yes, but not under this term. And I think that most of you will probably say similar to that as we dive into it. This is going to make a whole lot of sense to you. What I found, and then there's Eric. Hi, Eric. What I found as I've been, of course, you probably know that I focus a lot on mindsets, and that's not stopping. But what I've learned is that people don't go to bed at night thinking, how do I have a better mindset? Or how do I help others have a better mindset? I think that some of us probably in this group do. But I think a lot of us go to bed at night thinking, how do I become better? How do I help others people become better? And that term better is a loaded concept. And we're going to break that down. And vertical development, I think, is really what we are questioning when we're talking about being better. And so I'm going to help us hopefully understand that. And for me, it's been a game changer in a number of different ways. And at one point, I'm going to pause what we're covering, and I'm going to ask you, what about this is resonating with you, and what's standing out to you? So that's where we'll be headed. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get going a little bit more formally. So I appreciate you chatting in, letting me know that this concept, or at least this terminology of vertical development, is pretty new to most of you. All right, I gotta adjust my one slide before I present them, and then we'll be good.
And Ryan, quick question. Is this going to be recorded / like provided to us later on?
Yes, it is. So good question. So yes, I am recording this, and I want to send it out. We had about 250 people register, which is fantastic. I just anticipate that not all of them will be able to tune in live. And so I want to make sure that you get a copy of this as well as those who weren't able to tune in live. So let me just start with a brief purpose statement. And I guess it's not as brief as maybe I would like it to be, but I really appreciate you tuning in, because I do recognize that your time is valuable. And so I want you to get a significant return on your time. And one of the ways that I feel like we can do that is that this material will help you elevate, or at least gain clarity on how to elevate yourself and how to elevate those that you work with, so that you can enhance your or your organization's ability to more effectively navigate the world that we live in, which is one in which there is increasing change, pressure, uncertainty, and complexity. And I think that we are all feeling that. So I'm just bringing up this is going to be interesting if I can't see you. But all right. That's all right. So if you have any comments or questions as we go along, please do not hesitate to chat in or speak up. Either way, I'm consider myself pretty informal. So let me have you to chat in and answer here, but let me guide your answer here in just a second. So I want us to just look back on 2020. What a remarkable year in many different ways. And I want you to reflect on all of the people that you've encountered, or at least what you've seen, different perceptions. And I want us to explore the range of responses that we have seen from people as they've navigated 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's start at this low level. So the people that kind of handle this in the most negative ways, or respond to it in the most negative ways, how would you kind of categorize or classify their responses and their feelings? Good. So we're seeing fear, fearful, reactive, panic, denial, I like that, Phil. Deer in the headlights. Anti-authority. Interesting. Thanks, Cliff. Angry, unsure, right? So all of these are great. And I think there's Marla says concern for their livelihood, right? And part of this is an overwhelm and anxiety, right? Okay, so this is at the bottom tier here. If we were to move up a level, let's just say to the mid-level. So these are the folks that it's not necessarily fully negative, but it's also not fully positive. Exasperated, I like that. Good one. Tired, disbelieving, kind of when will it end, right? And that reminds me of just the word that I selected, which is surviving, right? So Sam and I were thinking on the same wavelength there. Irritated, right? So these are all good. So now let's think about those who have just handled this situation in a fantastic way. What has kind of been their outlook and their feelings? All right, so Josh and Eric are saying opportunity, hopeful, striving. I love this. Resilient, action-oriented, alternative thinking, supportive. We'll get through this together. I mean, even as we say these words, I don't know about you, but as I'm verbally saying them, I'm feeling a change within me, right? You feel more energized, right? So we get this energy and this opportunity. Now, the reality is here, and this is great, is that we all probably fluctuate across all of these levels at different points of time. And so I think a really important question is, where is your center of gravity? Now, because at times you could be at this energy and opportunity level, but then at other times you could be at overwhelm and anxiety. But where do you spend most of your time? Now, we're going to get into this pretty deeply as we go along here, but our center of gravity is a combination of two factors. One, it is what is going on in our current environment, the complexities, the pressure, the demands that are going on, right? But there's another element to this, and this is our capacity to deal with the current environment. This is our level or our altitude of vertical development. Now, when our altitude of vertical development surpasses the complexity of our situation, it is easier for us to operate at a higher center of gravity. But if our altitude of vertical development falls below the complexity of the situation, we're going to be inclined to take on a lower center of gravity. In fact, just as a quick caveat to this or sidestep to this, is I was reading a book. It was giving statistics of what percentage of college students seek out psychological help during their college experience. Now, there's nothing wrong with seeking out psychological help, but the percentage was something along the lines of 40%. Now, that was higher than I anticipated. And all this really says to me is that when you're coming out of teenage years and into adulthood, and you're moving away from home, that navigating college is a rather complex situation. And the reality is not all college students have the vertical development to be able to deal with that in a really effective way. Right? So what we might say to these college students is, and what colleges and universities are working towards doing a better job of helping students enhance the altitude of the vertical development. Of course, they're not using that terminology, and I think that they would get a lot of value if they did, because I think this type of terminology is something that is easily relatable, and I've seen a couple of comments related to that, which is great. So, but understanding this exposes several problems. And I believe that these are spoken problems. These are known problems. And I'm going to get your feedback on that here in just a minute. So the first problem is that 2020 has brought increasing change, pressure, and uncertainty and complexity to our world. And as the complexity has increased, it's exposed leaders' altitude of vertical development. In some cases, it's shown their bright sides, right? They've got a higher altitude than the complexity of the situation. but also for others, it's shown maybe their dark side. The second problem is the increasing change, pressure, uncertainty, and complexity that we are facing is outpacing our leadership development efforts. The reality is that traditional leadership development doesn't do the best job of enhancing the altitude of leaders. Not that it doesn't, it just doesn't do it significantly. What we've seen in the last year, we've seen a monumental shift in the complexity of our world. And the reality is that our development has not kept pace with that. And we need to catch up. That's kind of what we're in the position of doing. And then third, and getting back to what I mentioned just a little bit or alluded to, our traditional leadership development efforts have never really been very effective to begin with. So organizations spend over $300 billion on leadership development every year, but 75% of organizations rate their development programs as not very effective. And 71% of organizations don't feel their leaders are able to lead their organizations into the future. Now, I think this is a loaded statistic, but one that I interpret as being, I don't think organizations lack confidence in their leaders because those leaders lack knowledge and skills. Not to say that some don't, but I think they lack confidence in their leaders because the situation that they're in, they're maybe not big enough for their britches, if you will. And that's a way of thinking about vertical development. So I kind of mentioned and threw these three problems out as being known or stated problems. Would any of you disagree with any of these problems? So maybe just feel free to chat in, agree or disagree. And if you disagree, that's just fine. I think that spurs greater vertical development, the more that we have divergent opinions. So Joseph asking, how American are these stats? My understanding is that they do come from a US population. So good question. I'm not sure if that is fully generalizable of the world. But we're getting, I'm seeing everybody agreeing to these. And Jason's largely agree, which Jason plays in the training and development world. So he may push back on that number 3 a little bit, which I might as well, which is good. So when we know these problems, I think it brings up some aspirations for us. I think now that we know these, we want to aspire to elevate our personal ability to navigate change, pressure, uncertainty, and complexity. And we want to elevate really our world and our organizations through leadership development. And I don't know if you carry the same belief that I do, but I believe that if we elevate our leaders, we elevate the world. At least it improves our ability to do that. So I think this idea of elevating ourselves and elevating the world is that I think we know that this is possible. Like this is doable, but I don't know if you're anything like me, I would say for most of my adult life, I felt that it's possible, but I haven't felt like I've known how to do that. And I'm not going to say that I fully know how to do this, but I feel like the concepts that we're going to be covering here help enlighten our understanding in this regard. Gotcha, Jason. I'm just reading your comment, which is great. So thank you. I was putting words in your mouth and I appreciate the clarity. So let me more fully introduce vertical development. So what we've got here on the screen, and this is not the greatest figure, I'll be working on a better figure, but we've got a horizontal plane of development and we've got a vertical plane of development. On this horizontal plane is largely a focus on knowledge and skills. The vertical plane is more about our mental development. So let me compare these here. So our horizontal development, as I mentioned, is adding more knowledge, skills, and competencies. The focus here is on doing more. This isn't unlike adding an app onto an iPad. What this is doing is it's broadening our functionality. And this is really important. I'm never going to say that horizontal development isn't important. It surely is. Because we need to broaden our functionality. But horizontal development doesn't necessarily enhance how effectively that iPad operates itself. Right? It just allows it to do more. Vertical development, on the other hand, is elevating a person's thinking capacity to better navigate more complex and uncertain situations. The focus here is on being better. So if we use this iPad analogy, it's upgrading our operating system altogether. So when we look at this, we can now put in a three-dimensional figure here to maybe just kind of see where we are at or where a certain leader is at. Okay, they may have a lot of knowledge, some skills, and some vertical development, right? And one of the things that, as I don't know about you, but you've probably heard the have, do, be terminology. And to me, it maps on almost immediately. This is almost immediately popped in my head. So we've got the have, which is this knowledge. We have knowledge. We do, in terms of we perform skills. But then there's this being element here. And when we classify it like this, let me ask you a question here that I want you to chat in your answer. With this basic understanding of horizontal and vertical development, what is most common in, let's just say, in organizations when the organization tries to develop its leaders and people? Leo says we invest all of our money in horizontal stuff, right? And in school we can have vertical development in school. But there's not a whole lot of focus there. It's mainly on knowledge and skills. I mean, how I'm evaluated as a professor at Cal State Fullerton is the degree to which I give my students knowledge and skills. Like it's really hard for me to evaluate in such a vertical development in such a way that it relates to what at the end of the day needs to happen, which is kind of a flaw in our system, but it is our system, which is giving grades, right? So one of the things that's really important to recognize about the difference between horizontal and, or when we think about vertical development is this is really based upon research on adult development, which differs from child development. Children develop as a function of age, unless there's something that hinders that. Adults don't necessarily vertically develop as a function of age. They actually develop as a function of effort. And we'll get into this a little bit. But let me carry this idea forward. So a few months ago, I did a research project and I surveyed 153 organizations. And I asked them, what topics do you most commonly focus on in your leadership development efforts? And we had a list of 20 that showed up, and these were the most common topics focused on. I mean, let's just look at that top one. 72% focus on communication and interpersonal skills. That is really important, but also at the same time, what is that? Is that horizontal? Is it vertical? Well, it's horizontal, so it's not bad, but it's not vertical. This is just driving home the point is we generally don't focus on vertical development topics. So I'm actually curious because I'm always looking around for what are vertical development topics. And I'm curious how you might answer that question. So if you have any ideas about what are vertical development topics, so I see Pete saying emotional intelligence. I think that can be a vertical development topic, but I also find that how it's often delivered ends up being horizontal. Psychological safety, I think falls in that similar category. Very much can be vertical. Agility is a great one. That's great. Risk management, adaptation to changes, resilience, right? And which some of these align with some of the topics that I've kind of gathered. So, of course, I'm biased towards mindsets and grit. I also agree with Leo. But also grit, there's these topics I would say actually underlie grit. So some of these topics are things like mindsets, psychological flexibility, intellectual humility, the complexity of ourself, and really is an identity conversation, learn optimism, and mindfulness. Do we see ourselves as the object? Can we see ourselves as an object in our situation, or do we only see ourselves as being the actor in that situation? So these are all great responses. Here, gratitude definitely can be that. I think we oftentimes talk about it as terms of a skill. Here's how you implement it, but developing that, right, as an aspect of our being surely is an element of vertical development. So very good. So really where I want to take this is, again, horizontal development is not bad, but what I just want to focus on is the vertical development, this mental development, because I think that is widely lacking in our leadership development, but it's probably the most important type given the context of our world at the moment and the complexity of our world. So let me have you, let's just do a little evaluation here. What I'm going to do is I've got some questions here and I've got them phrased in terms of, I want you to think about the leaders in your organization. And I want you to kind of ask yourself, if I was to take this body of leaders, where would they fall along the spectrum in which I'm going to present? If you're not in a position of being a leader or in an organization like that, you could surely do this at an individual level. Where along this spectrum that I'm going to present do you respond? So here's the first one. How do your leaders respond to constructive criticism? So on one end, we've got they get defensive. In the middle, it depends on how it's delivered or who it's delivered by, or they see it as a gift, almost regardless of who delivers it or how it is delivered, right? All right, so we're seeing a lot of 4s in here, which is, nothing right, nothing wrong here, but we're kind of at 4. Here's another one. In a public class or training, our leaders will raise their hand only when they're confident that they have the right answers, right? They want to look good. They kind of want to show off. In the middle, it depends on who's in the class, right? If there's some senior people, they're going to be a little bit more reluctant. If there's all junior people, they're very much going to come forward. Or they raise their hand all the time because they want to test their understanding and get immediate feedback. They see this as an opportunity to learn. And every organization's culture is going to be different. So what I'm seeing is a little bit more on the higher side, but largely still falling in the middle there. When something goes wrong, our leaders first ask, who messed up? Or how do we fix this quickly and easily? Or on the higher end, how did I contribute to this? Jason brings up a great point. When you are higher on this list and your boss is lower on this list, there can be problems for you, which is surely the case, which I think is also, you're going to see why it's that dynamic. I think we become empowered to navigate that dynamic when we better understand the principles of vertical development. So good. So we're a little bit more on the lower end there. Here's a 4th one. We got one more after this. When someone presents a perspective that they don't agree with, our leaders typically try to get them to see why this other person is wrong. They tune out, or they seek to understand their position. All right, we got 3s and 4s. Nobody's going right in the middle. There's Mary Kay's got a 4 right in the middle, right? Which is good. All right, last one here. When facing change or disruption, our leaders tend to push back to ensure stability, certainty, security, and comfort. They embrace it only when it's easy for them to do so, or they welcome the change and disruption as an opportunity to grow and adapt. Great. So we're seeing a range here again, no surprise, which is fine. So then if I was to kind of take your answers and say, where are leaders on average? Where would we put them? I would say at a 4. All right. We seem to fall in the middle, which I'm going to classify as a moderate amount of mental development. Now, to make this come to life a little bit more, it's really valuable for us to understand that there is roughly 3 different mind levels. Now, we could probably classify this as 3, as 5, as 7, as 57, right? But adult development researchers have largely identified 3 different levels. Some break it down and then they spread it out to either 7 or 9. But the base classification is that they usually have 3. And I think that this is really helpful. And I'm going to call these mind levels, mind 1.0, mind 2.0, and mind 3.0. And what research on adult development has found is that 64% of people primarily operate in mind 1.0. 35% of people primarily operate in mind 2.0, and only 1% of people primarily operate in mind 3.0. Now, this is the global adult population at large, and the percentages differ a little bit when we look just at leaders. We're going to find a higher percentage in mind 2.0, a lower percentage mind 1.0, and a slightly higher percentage in mind 3.0. So let me just kind of break down each of these levels just a little bit more. When we are in mind 1.0, we are in self-preservation mode. So we are on near consistent lookout to threats to our image, our ego, and our identity, right? So somebody in a classroom setting, if they are reluctant to raise their hand because it may make them look bad, they are effectively in self-preservation mode. Those who are in self-preservation mode are generally more dependent thinkers. They're faithful followers and they're reliant upon authority. They're just kind of okay falling in line. There's nothing wrong with that, other than there are implications for us if we continually operate in mind 1.0 mode. Common feelings that folks in mind 1.0 have, not that they have this all the time, but it's very easy for them to feel overwhelmed, powerless, have low energy, envious, angry, defensive, controlling. Right? Even as I say these words, there's leaders that I know that come to mind. It's like, yep, you're in mind 1.0 mode, right? So that's mind 1.0. Mind 2.0 is self-focused reward mode. We are focused on reaching goals. We want pleasure, gains, praise, popularity, power, privilege, success, any of those, and maybe even all of them. When we're in mind 1.0, we're more independent thinkers. We're more self-directed, but we have a tendency to be focused on the shorter term selfish gains. How I looked, did I hit my numbers? Am I advancing? And common feelings when we're in mind 2.0 is we're competitive, we're egotistical, we're rigid, impatient, anxious, argumentative, have a tendency to be judgmental. And then mind 3.0 is what I would classify as contribution mode. When we're here, we are focused on adding value to others instead of ourselves, our protection, or our advancement. We operate here as, and Phil's going to like this terminology, as a wise sage, an interdependent thinker that can see and hold multiple perspectives. When we're here, our common feelings are centered, resilient, hopeful, compassionate, curious, present, content, agile. I think one of the best management books that I've read is the book by Gallup, First Break All the Rules. And if I remember correctly, there's an example of an employee showing up late to work. And they would ask leaders, how do you respond to an employee showing up late to work? Well, a leader can respond in self-preservation mode, right? You're affecting me, my comfort, and my safety. So I'm going to, maybe I just put up with it, right? Or in the self-focused reward mode, we're going to be inclined to be a little bit more authoritative. Of, you can't be late, I'm writing you up, right? That's an extreme example. Or there's this contribution mode, which is, let me understand why they were late. So Tracy says, does Mind 3.0 occur naturally as leaders strive to give back, perhaps more towards the end of one's career? A really good question. We tend to see it more with people more senior in their career, partly because they don't feel the same pressure as those that are more junior in their career. Remember, our level of vertical development and our center of gravity, which I'm going to get to here in just a minute, is based upon our context and our capacity to deal with that context. But also we need to recognize is there's a lot of more people who are older in age that surely are not in contribution mode. So age can play a factor, and this is an area where I'm collecting some data on, so hopefully I'll be able to give a better answer here. But one of the things I want to point out here is I drew this dotted line in here to help signify that if we are below this line, we are in a selfish mode. We are inwardly focused. We are focused on either our comfort and safety or on winning. When we are above the line, we are in an outward mode. We are focused on adding value, the contributions that we have and that we are making. And depending upon the mode that we are in, we are naturally and non-consciously going to respond differently to different situations. So when we are in mind 1.0 and we receive constructive criticism, we're going to get defensive. In fact, yesterday I got an email that was full of swear words about me and how I'm a terrible person. That immediately, if I'm being very honest with you, put me in mind 1.0 mode. I had to take, actually a little bit of time, actually talk it out with a mentor of mine in order to get me back up into what I would say I'm more normally in, which is mind 2.0 and mind 3.0. Jason, I wish it was you, which is good. So depending upon our mind level, what we consider to be our best and most correct actions in that moment is going to change depending upon our mind level. So one of the things that I hope you're getting a sense of is that each of us could be in any of these levels. Right? I think that there's an element of as we vertically develop, we change the percentage of time that we are in these levels. So this gets us back to this topic of center of gravity. If we are low in terms of our vertical development, we're going to spend most of our time or a higher percentage of our time in mind 1.0. When we're here, we can be rather rigid. We don't like change. We want to feel comfortable. We want to feel safe. So we kind of stick with what we know and what we know is best. When we're in this middle level of vertical development, which you seem to suggest that most of your leaders are in, we're generally operating in mind 2.0. I want to reach goals. I want to get ahead. When we're here, we can bend, but we could also reach the point of breaking. But there's this high vertical development space where we spend maybe the majority of our time in mind 3.0. Not that we're going to spend all of our time there, because I think that's impossible to do. But this has been very helpful for me to think about myself and my vertical development. So it's not just what level am I am my mind 1.0, mind 2.0, mind 3.0. It's what level am I at the majority of the time? And how do I go about getting in mind 3.0 more of the time? In fact, let me give you just a quick example of this. I did some work with a massive telecommunications company last year. And we were doing some webinars, and I was working with the top 500 leaders in an organization over 200,000 employees. But this top 500 leaders was minus the top 100 leaders. So it was from 100 to 500 in that top echelon. And what was interesting to me is that this organization had a leadership development program for these leaders from 100 to 500. They did not have a leadership development program for the top 100 leaders. Almost as I talked to them, as anecdotally, they would say, their leadership development team would say, they're not open to receiving development. They kind of think that they have arrived, was some of that mentality. And so as I was working with these leaders from 100 to 500, it became very clear that, and one of the things we did my mindset assessment, is many of them had negative mindsets, particularly a fixed mindset and more of an inward mindset. And so it led me to ask them questions. Why is this? And the answer repeatedly came back in different forms that we feel a lot of pressure to hit our metrics by those above us. And so when we feel so much pressure, of course, we're going to focus on looking good and getting ahead, which are the desires associated with a fixed mindset and an inward mindset. So effectively, they were saying our context, this is a really high pressure context that is causing us to operate in mind 2.0 the predominant amount of the time. And so we need to figure out ways. Now, if I'm going to work with this organization, what we need to do is we need to figure out a way, one, to change the environment to help these leaders feel more psychologically safe. But at the same time, they still need to deliver. That's really important. So we also need to enhance their vertical development, the altitude of their vertical development, so that they can better navigate that high pressure and difficult situation. Leo says, have you designed a test to compute the center of gravity? That is one of my to-do lists, things on my to-do list, which is good. So I will hopefully be getting there soon. So let me pause here and just kind of check in with where we are. And I'm curious, what insights are you having when it comes to these different topics that I've introduced? Vertical versus horizontal development, the 3 different levels of vertical development, mind 1.0, mind 2.0, and this idea of center of gravity, and that we spend a different percentage of time in these different mind levels. So feel free to chat that in, or if you wanted to come live and just kind of make a comment about if this is bringing up any insights for you, I'd love to hear it.
So Ryan, I'll start. So I think change is hard. So that's why I think shifting that center of gravity is difficult. That's all I'll say.
Great. And I agree with you. It's surely not easy. I think one of the values of understanding this for me has been when you understand what vertical development is, when you understand the different levels of vertical development, and if you understand that nobody fully operates in just mind 1.0 or mind 2.0. If you think that way, they're going to get defensive. Then it allows for greater clarity about what do I need to do, or what do I need to do? So what do I need to do personally, or what do I need to do to help others to elevate, right? Because it changes the conversation, in my mind, at least, away from topics around horizontal development, such as adding new knowledge or skills, and more around topics that I think we just aren't accustomed to talking about, such as intellectual humility or mindfulness. Was there somebody else who wanted to make a comment?
Ryan, one of the things that is coming up is, some people have said it in the chat, this is Shauna, that you have to be already open. So this is where the mindfulness comes in. You have to be open to development to move beyond this horizontal development to vertical. And then also that from a leadership standpoint, culturally, what's rewarded is not vertical development. So it's not just that you have to have an open mindset. You have to understand that what you're seeking is countercultural, and which means that there's going to be some discomfort. There's going to be some swimming upstream. And it makes me think how many people are really willing to do that, to risk the status quo, when what we're talking about today isn't what's rewarded.
Yeah, you're so right. So that's a huge insight, because when we start to have this conversation, it changes what the behaviors and the things that we incentivize, right? We look at struggle not as a bad thing, but as something to embrace. And really, if we think about, as we talk about navigating complex and uncertain situations, that's really a valuable skill to have. So that's a huge insight. Thank you.
Hey, Ryan.
Somebody else who want to make a comment.
Ryan?
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
So when I think of when you say elevate, I think in the descriptive words, to me, that's a roadmap, or those are terms that are hard to operationalize. And if there's a way to convert it to verbs, because I think the growth is when we put it into action and actually work towards achieving it, as opposed to just thinking about it mentally. as a construct. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but.
Yeah, and I think it does. And I think that's where it's helpful to get some terminology around what are topics that really are vertical development topics. To me, that's helpful. Susmitha.
Hey, Ryan. I'm Susmitha here, everyone. And we do use vertical integration here at work to a great extent. And my question to you was also in the chat boxes. Do you see them? I see them as two different, not distinct, but as intertwined ropes. One is the processes which speaks to fill the action verbs. What is the process they are going to adopt and adapt to meet the vertical integration? And the other, of course, is the mindset and the mindfulness, which is a cultural, behavioral kind of an aspect of within a company, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, what caught attention was the 2.0 and the 3.2. We're constantly moving, at least at the mid-level seniority levels where we're constantly moving and juggling. And that comes from another point that you made. Is it because the leaders are hearing to you from the people, depending on who is presenting it to them, like a constructive feedback, or it could be even just proposal for a project? A few people get heard, a few don't, for certain reasons that they know or don't know, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe it is more of what Phil said is, how do you elevate them and how do you teach them not only to be mindful of when they're not getting heard and they're in the 2.2 because now they're getting kicked back and they go into those negative feelings about themselves, and can come back to 3.2 because now they're empowered with that action verb that Phil is talking about is, how do I get over that? How do I recognize what I did? What is the gap within me? I think that is what caught my attention in your slides. Is probably that's a great indicator, a self-indicator. And that could be a tool that the leadership can take, and even a regular employee like us can take.
Yeah, no, I love that. So two thoughts came to mind as you're seeing that. One is when we understand these different mind levels, in any given moment, we can engage in introspection. What level am I at? And how did I get here? And then how do I get out of it? Right. So there's a variety of different practices, and we won't go into all those, but those are things like deep breathing, talking to a mentor, exercising, that are ways to get us out of mind 1.0 or mind 2.0. And then what we're doing those things with a purpose and a focus, and that's to get to mind 3.0. The other thing that came to mind was just this idea of, there's this perception, and I think it's out there for a reason, is that when an organization goes public, they lose their identity. And there's other factors that go on with that. But I think one of the reasons when we understand this from a vertical development perspective is when you go public, you gain pressure that you never had before to return something to shareholders. Well, if we get inundated as leaders in that effectively will put us in mind 2.0. And what is required of leaders, if we look at the really great public companies, they generally have leaders that are able to rise above that pressure associated with being public. And they're able to be more of this wise sage and better able to navigate for the long term as opposed to the short term. So that was a thought that came to mind. I appreciate you sharing, Susmitha. Leo, let's go to you. I'll take one more comment, and then I just want to get through some more material, and then we'll leave it up to any questions or comments at the end. So Leo, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's the idea, I think, that was mentioned about the rewards and standing in the reward in Mind 3.0 is usually not rewarded. And on the opposite of the spectrum, it may also feel that if you want to grow, you'll have to show your vulnerabilities, you'll have to accept the hard truth. And I think some people may feel that instead there's going to be some punishment, it's going to be used against them instead. And it makes it very, very hard to actually switch to that mode. And like you said, if you're in a public entity, showing those vulnerabilities makes it even harder. So that's why, for example, when you read Ray Dalio and having that total transparency, or the idea of radical candor, those are great concepts to actually not be afraid of that. There's nothing's going to happen to you, but indeed sometimes it does, and so we remember the pain. We less remember the pleasure, the business pleasure.
Yeah. No, that's great. So, and it speaks as you say those words with Ray Dalio and then radical candor, like some of those words come from books that I've read, which is Principles by Ray Dalio, Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, which I love. And both of those organizations is they're thinking about this from two different perspectives: shaping the culture and elevating the people. And both have got to happen in order for us to shift the center of gravity of our leaders. And so that really gets me where I wanted to go next is just, we could spend all day talking about this, but briefly talking about how do we move? How do we shift? And Joseph says, I wonder how social safety nets help. They're huge, in fact, as I think that's really important, because if we don't feel psychologically safe, where are we naturally going to reside? We're going to reside largely in a mind 1.0 mode, right? So if we want to move and make shifts in terms of our vertical development, we have got to include a focus on the mind. So let me push this forward a little bit by asking you a question. So let me have you respond in the chat box. True or false? Most current leadership development practices are rooted in philosophies that were developed pre-2005. All right, so most of us are saying true, if we say pre-1960, which you could possibly make the case for that, right? And this is interesting, and this date is really interesting, because we have learned more about the mind in the last 15 years than all of time before that. I mean, look at this. This is from ProQuest database. When I search neuroscience and look at the number of articles published across different 15-year increments, here's what we see. I mean, it's unreal how much we have learned about the mind in the last 15 years. And if we are engaging in leadership development practices that are rooted pre-2005, by their very nature, they are overlooking the mind. And it's not because those that developed them blatantly did that. It's because we didn't have an understanding of the mind to begin with. So now that we have this knowledge, we need to start integrating a focus on the mind in our leadership development efforts. But that's a loaded question in a way, because our mind is incredibly complex. So what about the mind do we focus on? And there's a variety of things, but I believe that I can make a pretty strong case that the element of the mind that is the most important for us to focus on for vertical development is our mindsets. The neural connections that control our non-conscious automatic processing. So our mindsets, and another way to think about this is they are our mental lenses. You see, our mindsets are largely, not solely, but largely the result of our upbringing. The mindsets that we developed as we were going through our child development stages are really the wiring in the brain that would best allow us to effectively navigate our childhood environment. So if we had a really positive, psychologically safe environment, then that wired us to probably a more healthy way of processing the world. If we grew up in an abusive situation, our brain is going to get wired in a very different way, in which probably makes it very difficult for us to navigate outside of kind of the walls that we have built for ourselves. If we navigate in an environment, let's just say if I was raised with a military parent and we ended up traveling the world and living in different locations, well, that's going to wire my brain in a very different way than for me. I really grew up essentially in the same house my whole childhood. So the wiring that we developed through our formative experiences is not likely to be the wiring that we need to navigate a complex corporate environment or whatever environment, a family environment, a relationship, right? In order for us to better navigate in the future, we need to recognize that we come a little bit ill-equipped and we have some work to do when it comes to the wiring in our mind. So this includes, if we want to rewire the mind through a focus on mindsets, it's going to include awakening to our mindsets. One, awakening to mindsets in general. Let's understand them. And then two, what are our mindsets? Then we need to awaken to the current impact of our mindsets. When we understand the impact and see the connections between maybe if I have a fixed mindset, and this led me to not raise my hand in class because I was afraid of looking bad, then I'm gonna better see this was a missed opportunity. This is going to create what is called a heat experience that allows us to think more deeply about our mental lenses and how we're seeing the world. And then we've also need to shape the environment and exercise our positive mindsets to activate and strengthen them so that we can, when we're encountering situations, that we naturally and automatically respond to them in more effective ways. I'm looking at some of these comments here, see if there's any questions. So that's a very brief way of talking about how do we elevate it. Well, it requires a focus on the mind. But what questions is this leaving you with? Any questions?
How do you awaken the leaders or the mindset?
Good question. So I'm going to answer that maybe a little bit more fully. But what I found in terms of the work that I've done with organizations focusing on mindsets is my mindset assessment has helped folks get a foot in the door. Now, I would say 80% of people, 2/3 to 80% of people, when they learn about mindsets, they naturally say, how do I get better? There's maybe 20 to 33% of people that they are so stuck in mind 1.0 that it is really difficult for them to think outside of that mode and do some introspective and say, I want to get better. They're just defensive. They see the assessment as an attack. And so to a certain number of people, the mindset, I think for the vast majority of people, like a mindset assessment helps facilitate some of that awakening. For others, there's that type of a direct approach may not work for them. And we need to help them first feel more safe. We need to kind of give them the safety nets around them, which will allow them to loosen up. And there's different activities and exercises that we can do to do that in a relatively short amount of time. So that's a very big question, and that's my very short answer to that question. But because there's a lot of depth there.
And a quick
and I surely don't have all the answers.
So quick follow-up, Brian. Can you be successful? And you can help us define success. Can you be successful if you're stuck in 1.0?
So I think it's a good question, and I'll be interested in what other people think on the matter. But my guess is if there's anything like,
No.
I think that my guess is we can identify leaders that are out there that are socially successful, that are in mind 1.0. I also think that the vast majority of people that are out there that we would classify as socially successful would be in mind 2.0. But that would be my hunch. So I wouldn't say you can't be successful, because what ends up happening is when we are in mind 1.0 or mind 2.0, what we're actually strongly driven by is our fears. And our fears can be incredibly motivating. So I don't know how many of you watched this series about the Chicago Bulls that was on ESPN called, I think it was The Last Dance. To me, it seemed very clear that Michael Jordan primarily operated in mind 2.0. And he was incredibly successful doing so. And he could be a complete prick at times. So that's just an example. It's not a 1.0 example, but my guess is if we thought hard enough about it, we could find a mind 1.0 person who is successful. Any other questions? I'm seeing a lot of comments, which are good. And I really appreciate talking to each other.
You open the comments, Ryan?
Sure.
So when you put the graphic up there about 1 to 2 to 3, it reminds me of the metaphor. That's a wonderful playbook. But like any sports team, you got to practice. And I think the key for any executive is to figure out opportunities for people to practice where they can feel like they're successful in achieving what they're trying to do. And I think that gives you the highest potential to elevate somebody's leadership is by giving them opportunities to practice where they don't fall and make a fool of themselves, and they gain confidence along the way. And that can be done in a variety of ways, but that's, to me, the challenge for all. And of course, somebody in one, you try to get them a coach. And I've had some successful people in one, and I see big changes in them coming now, but it takes lots of work, and they have to want to do it. That's the first thing. They have to recognize that they want to change and they want to grow. And then, sometimes it takes a village or an army to help people change. So
yeah, let me build off of that and give us the example of Microsoft. So if we look at Microsoft since the year 2000, they've had two CEOs, Steve Ballmer from 2000 to 2014, and then Satya Nadella from 2014 to 2020. Now, if you know anything about these leaders, they definitely operate at different mind levels. Steve Ballmer, more on the mind 2.0, very competitive. Satya Nadella, largely mind 3.0, very collaborative. And the difference that they've had on Microsoft has been remarkable. I mean, this is a figure showing their market capitalization during their tenure and the changes here. I mean, it's just remarkable. And this is in 6 years, really, since Satya Nadella took over as Microsoft. Been a huge change. Well, what's his focus been? It's been on mindsets as a way to vertically develop employees. So yes, this is difficult to do, but it surely can be done in a rather remarkable way here when it comes to Microsoft. In terms of my own research, when I did my research of the 153 organizations, the topics that focus primarily on vertical development, mindsets, and mindfulness were among the least focused topics, but the organizations that implemented these were the most effective at developing their leaders based upon their self-reports. So in terms of the work that I do with organizations is I have a vertical development program that starts with a mindset assessment to get a sense of how vertically developed our leaders are, which includes a collective mindset report. Let me just walk you through really quickly. Such a report in this organization, very fixed-minded, which we could classify as 1.0, focused on preserving their image. Quite closed-minded, maybe somewhere between my 1.0 and my 2.0, focused on being right and being in control. When we looked at prevention and promotion, they're quite promotion-minded, which I classified them in Mind 2.0. They're very much focused on reaching goals, but I wasn't sold that they were focused on reaching goals to contribute, more focused on reaching goals to themselves get ahead, which comes to light when we focus on this last set of mindsets, when they largely have this inward mindset in Mind 1.0. So we could get a very clear understanding of the level of these leaders' vertical development and really their center of gravity, right? And so once we have that, then we can engage in workshops that introduce vertical development and mindsets. This helps create a shared language, and then it's a place to present these collective mindset results to help that awakening to occur. We could deepen that awakening through individual or small group coaching. And then we've got to create a mindset gym for our leaders. We've got to help them over time continually work out their positive mindset neural connections to elevate their vertical development. And so we need to explore the culture and the incentives that are there, as well as implement practices to help them enhance their mindsets. And so like a tool that I've developed is the digital mindset coach. So through all of this, what we would be doing is providing heat experiences, colliding perspectives, and elevated sense making, which folks who have focused on vertical development longer than I have says these are the necessary things that must occur for vertical development. So as I say this, I want to, and as we're running out on time here, is if this is something that you want to dive into more deeply within your organization or even at a personal level, I would love to connect with you. And I'm going to be sending out some information about how you can do that. Here's some links that are here. You can grab some time on my calendar, or you can shoot me an email. But also, if there are people that you know that you think that they would be really interested in this type of work and ideas, I would really love a connection, or even you could pass off, as I'm sending you a recording of this, pass this off to them. So I know that we are at the end of the time here, so feel free to take off, but I'm happy to stick around here for a little bit to answer any questions that you have and dive into this further. So let me stop there. But again, if you want to dive into this deeper, let me know, and I will be sending out some follow-up material later today or tomorrow with more content. So I probably should have saved a little bit more time here at the end, but really appreciate you all joining. I appreciate the feedback here in the chat box, which is great. So if you have, like I said, I'm happy to stick around, continue chatting about this. So if you have any questions, feel free to chat them in as we're kind of closing out here, and then we could be a little bit more conversational here in just a minute. Mary, do I have a rate structure? Yes, but it also depends on what exactly you would like to accomplish. So for example, all of these things, these 4 things here are things that I could do and help you with. And I think ideally, the best program is going to implement all of those. But I would say that not all organizations may have the budget to do all of those elements. So there's a bit of customization that can be done.